You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. But the morning of March 15th, a girl walked into my courtroom who made me question everything I knew about human arrogance. What she said to me, what she did right in front of everyone, I still can't believe it happened. And when I finally delivered my verdict, the entire courtroom erupted. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about justice, character, and what happens when someone thinks they're above the law. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for 40 years, and I still wake up early like I'm a kid on the first day of school. I've had my morning coffee the same way for 40 years, strong, black, no sugar. My clerk Christina knows exactly how I like it, and I swear she can smell it on me before I even reach the hallway. I've been married to my wife for a long time, and she knows when I've had a tough day before I even say a word. I can walk into the kitchen, loosen my tie, and she'll look up from the table and say, "What happened today?" I always laugh because she's usually right. She's been my partner through every late night, every heavy case, and every time I sat in silence thinking about what justice really means. My father immigrated from Italy with nothing but hope and a work ethic. He didn't have fancy words, but he had truth. My father always told me, you can be poor in your pocket, but don't be poor in your character. I didn't understand it when I was young. I thought he meant money. I learned later he meant something bigger. Every morning I get to the courthouse at 8:15, been doing it for decades, almost like my body has a clock set inside it. I park in the same spot when it's available. I walk the same path through the same doors. I nod at the same security officer, and I always ask how his kids are doing. I learned early in my career that people don't always come to court because they're bad people. Sometimes they come to court because they're scared. Sometimes they come because they're broke. Sometimes they come because nobody ever taught them how to handle trouble without making it worse. I've watched grown men cry like children at my bench. I've watched teenagers pretend they don't care when their hands are shaking so hard they can't hold their paperwork. I've also learned something else in 40 years. Some people walk into my courtroom thinking it's a stage. They think they can charm their way out. They think they can buy their way out. They think rules are for other people. Those cases are the ones that test me because I have to be firm without losing my humanity. That particular morning, I remember everything clearly. I remember the air outside being cold, but not bitter. I remember the smell of the courthouse, that mix of old stone, paper, and polish. I remember the sound of shoes on the floor, echoing down the hall like a slow drum. I remember Christina handing me my coffee with that little smile she always has. I could smell it right away, and I felt that first quiet comfort of the day, like I had armor on. I sat at my desk, I opened my case files, and I told myself, all right, let's do some good today. It was a Wednesday in March. I got to the courthouse at 8:15 like always, and I saw Christina already at her desk, sorting files. I heard the printer running. I heard the low hum of voices outside the courtroom doors. That sound always tells me life is waiting, because every file is a person, and every person is a story. I was going through my case files when I noticed one folder that felt heavier than the rest, not in weight, but in meaning. You know what I mean when I say that. I've held papers that felt like nothing, and I've held papers that felt like a whole storm was inside them. My gut was telling me to pay attention. Something felt different that morning. I could sense it before anyone even spoke. I could feel tension in the room, like a string pulled too tight. I've sat on that bench long enough to read the temperature of a crowd. Some days it's calm, some days it's angry. That day felt sharp. I walked into my courtroom and I looked out the way I always do. I scan faces. I look for fear. I look for arrogance. I look for someone who seems lost. I listen to the little sounds people make when they're nervous. I hear the coughs, the whispers, the tapping of fingers on knees. I took my seat and I adjusted my robe. I placed my hands where I always do, and I felt the wood under my palms, smooth from years of use. I looked at Christina, and she nodded at me like she always does, like we were two people about to step into a familiar dance. I called the first case, and I watched the young mother come forward with a parking ticket she couldn't afford. I listened. I asked questions. I saw her eyes dart to the floor like she expected me to yell. I didn't. I never forget what it's like to be scared of authority, because I grew up around men who spoke loud when they felt powerless. I gave her a plan. I gave her time. I watched her shoulders relax, as if someone had taken a brick off her back. That's why I do this. That small moment of relief matters. I kept going. I moved through the morning docket, one story after another. I heard a man explain how he missed his court date because he was at dialysis. I heard a college kid admit he was driving too fast because he was late for his exam. I heard a woman confess she ignored a ticket because she didn't know what to do. Then I called the case that changed the whole day. The first person I called that morning was a woman named Mrs. Santos. I watched as she walked in, and I could tell immediately she didn't want to take up space. I saw her clutching her purse strap like it was keeping her steady. I saw her nurse's badge still clipped to her sweater, like she came straight from a shift. I looked at her face and I saw exhaustion, the honest kind. I've seen that look on people who work hard and don't complain. I felt something in my chest tighten because something about her reminded me of my own mother, always moving, always carrying the weight of a family. I asked her what happened, and she looked me right in the eyes and said she had a citation for an expired inspection sticker. I heard her voice tremble just a little when she explained she was working overtime and caring for her mother at home. I listened carefully because it's never just a sticker. It's always a life. I asked her how much she makes. I asked her what bills she has. I asked her if her car is safe. I watched her blink fast, like she was trying not to cry. I know that look. It's the look of someone who has been holding it together for too long. I said to her, and I kept my voice gentle, "Mrs. Santos, you're not here because you don't care. You're here because life got heavy." I saw her mouth open like she wanted to speak, but didn't trust her voice. I leaned forward because I wanted her to hear me as a person, not as a robe. I told her something my father taught me. I said, "Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. and you've earned respect by showing up here and telling the truth." I saw tears form in her eyes, and I felt my own throat tighten because I never get used to seeing someone so tired finally feel seen. I looked at her paperwork again, and I made a decision. I said, "Case dismissed." I could see her whole body react, like she almost didn't believe it. I watched her hand cover her mouth, and I saw her shoulders shake with quiet relief. She whispered, "Thank you," like it was a prayer. I nodded and I said, "Go take care of that car and go take care of yourself." I watched her walk away, and I saw her wipe her cheek quickly, like she didn't want anyone to notice. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who thinks rules don't apply to them? Someone who believes money solves everything? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. I thought the moment would settle the room. I thought compassion would calm things down. I was wrong. Sometimes kindness shines a light on ugliness hiding in the back. I heard it then, a laugh, coming from the back of my courtroom. It wasn't loud at first, but it was sharp, like someone snapping a twig. I stopped mid-breath and I looked up. I saw a teenage girl sitting there with her legs crossed, like she was waiting for a manicure appointment. I saw her phone in her hand, and I saw her nails, long and bright, tapping the screen like my courtroom was just background noise. I watched her smirk, and I felt the room shift. I don't like that kind of laugh. I've heard it before. It's the laugh of someone who thinks suffering is entertainment. It's the laugh of someone who hasn't been humbled yet. I watched her roll her eyes as Mrs. Santos walked past her. That told me everything. I saw Mrs. Santos flinch just a little, like she felt the sting of disrespect even without a word. I didn't say anything right then. I held it. I've learned something about authority. You don't always have to roar. Sometimes you just watch and wait, because people reveal themselves if you give them time. At 10:30, Christina called her case. I looked down at the file and I saw the name, Ava Montgomery. I saw her age listed as 17. I saw the charge, reckless driving, speeding, and a failure to appear for a previous citation. I raised my eyes, and I watched her stand up like she was stepping onto a red carpet. I saw her outfit, expensive and loud. I saw the designer bag hanging from her shoulder like a trophy. I saw her hair perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. I watched her walk to the front with that slow confidence that isn't confidence at all. It's armor. It's practiced. It's the kind of walk someone learns when they've been told their whole life that consequences are for other people. I asked her to state her name for the record. I heard her sigh before she even spoke. She said it like she was bored. I looked at her and I said, "Miss Montgomery, you understand why you're here?" I watched her shrug like it was nothing. I heard her say, "Yeah, I guess. It's just a ticket." I felt my jaw tighten because I don't let people shrink the law into something cute when it's serious. I said, "It's not just a ticket. You were clocked at 92 in a 55. I watched her face stay flat, like numbers didn't mean anything to her. I said, "Do you know what that speed can do to a person on the road?" I saw her glance at her phone again. I heard her say, "Nobody got hurt, so what's the big deal?" I had to take a deep breath and count to 10 because that sentence carries a whole worldview inside it. I leaned forward and I said, "The big deal is that you don't get to gamble with other people's lives." I watched her blink slowly, and I could tell she wasn't listening with her heart. She was listening with her ego. I asked her why she failed to appear last time. I heard her laugh again, this time louder, like she wanted the room to know she wasn't afraid. She said, "I had stuff to do, school, whatever." I looked toward Christina, and I saw her close her eyes and shake her head just a little. Christina has seen a lot too, and that tiny movement told me she felt the same thing I felt. I said, "Miss Montgomery, I need you to put your phone away." I watched her stare at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Then I watched her do something that still makes my blood pressure rise when I remember it. I watched her hold the phone up and say, "I'm texting my dad. He's going to handle this." I heard murmurs ripple through the gallery. I heard a man in the back whisper, "Oh boy." I said, "No, Miss Montgomery, you're going to handle this. You're the one standing in front of me." I watched her smile like she thought I was joking. Then she said the words that gave this story its title. She looked right at me, right in my eyes, and she said, "Call my daddy." I felt the courtroom go quiet in a way that almost makes your ears ring. I could hear the air system hum. I could hear someone swallow. I could smell my coffee still on my breath. And for a strange second, that smell grounded me, like it reminded me I was real, and this was real. I removed my glasses and I rubbed my eyes. I did it slowly because I didn't want to react with anger. I wanted to react with purpose. I put my glasses back on and I looked at her again. I said, "Miss Montgomery, I'm not here to talk to your father. I'm here to talk to you." I watched her roll her eyes again, and she said, "He pays for everything. He'll pay this too." I said, "Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Money can pay a fine, but money can't pay back a life if you take one on the road." I watched her face stay blank, and I felt that familiar frustration rise up like hot water. She leaned on the rail like my courtroom was her kitchen counter. She said, "Your Honor, I spend more on shoes than this fine." I heard a few people gasp. I heard one woman whisper, "Shame." I felt my blood pressure rising. I'm not going to lie. I've learned to keep my voice steady, but I'm still human. I'm still a man who believes respect matters. I said to her, "This is a court of law, not a shopping mall." I saw her smirk again, like she thought that line was cute. She said, "Whatever, just call him." I asked her why she was driving that fast. I watched her shrug and say, "I was late." I said, "Late for what?" She said, "It doesn't matter. It's not like I hit anyone." I felt something heavy settle in my stomach because that's how tragedy begins. It begins with, "It didn't happen this time." It begins with someone believing the worst outcome is a myth. I looked out at the gallery and I saw Mrs. Santos sitting back there still, waiting for a friend's case. I saw her eyes on the teen, and I saw sadness in her face, like she wasn't even angry. She just looked tired, like she'd seen too much. I looked back at Ava and I said, "I've learned one thing in 40 years. The law doesn't care about your bank account, it cares about your actions." I watched her lean her head to the side and say, "You're being dramatic." I took a slow breath. I said, "No, I'm being responsible." I tapped the file with my finger. I said, "You failed to appear. You ignored the last notice. You treated this whole thing like a joke." She laughed again and said, "Because it is. It's a joke. You guys just want money." I heard the room react, that low sound people make when they can't believe what they're hearing. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. If you've ever felt that frustration, watching someone disrespect something important, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I never saw coming in my entire career. I looked at Ava and I said, "You want me to call your father?" I saw her grin widen like she'd won. She said, "Yeah, put him on speaker. He'll straighten this out." I had a choice in that moment. I could refuse and move on. I could hold her in contempt. I could lecture her until the walls shook. But I've learned that sometimes the best lesson is letting someone hear themselves out loud in front of reality. So I said, "All right, I'll make you a deal." I watched her eyes brighten. I said, "I'll call your father, but you're going to listen, and you're going to speak respectfully, and he's going to speak respectfully too." She looked so sure of herself. She said, "He will." I nodded at Christina, and I asked for the number. Ava said it out loud, like she didn't have a worry in the world. Christina dialed it on the court phone, and I watched Ava stand there with her chin up, like a queen waiting for her servant. I could hear the ringing. Each ring felt like a step toward a cliff. My gut was telling me to pay attention, because something about the confidence felt too big, too careless. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just dealing with a speeding ticket. I was dealing with a whole family story that had never been challenged. Then the phone picked up. I heard a man's voice, deep and impatient. He said, "Yeah?" I said, "Sir, this is Judge Caruso from Providence Municipal Court. Your daughter asked me to call you." I watched Ava smile like she was about to watch fireworks. I heard the man pause. Then he said, "Oh, for God's sake, what is it now?" I said, "Your daughter is here for reckless driving and a failure to appear." I heard him exhale hard. Then I heard him say something that made my eyebrows lift. He said, "How much? I'll pay it. Put it on whatever. I'm in a meeting." I felt my stomach tighten because he didn't ask if she was safe. He didn't ask what happened. He asked how much. I looked at Ava and I saw her eyes sparkle like this was proof she was untouchable. I said, "Sir, this is not a payment window. This is a courtroom." I heard him laugh, and it wasn't even a nice laugh. It was the laugh of a man who hasn't been told no in a long time. He said, "Judge, listen, I donate more to the city than your salary. Let her go. I'll take care of it." I heard a few people in the gallery inhale sharply. I could feel heat rise in my face, but I kept my voice level. I said, "Sir, I don't discuss my salary in my courtroom, and donations don't buy immunity." I looked at Ava and I said, "Do you hear how your father is talking?" She rolled her eyes again like it was normal. That told me everything too. I said into the phone, "Sir, your daughter's behavior in court has been disrespectful." I heard him snap. "Disrespectful? She's a kid. She's busy. This is a waste of time." I felt a quiet sadness then, because I've seen this pattern. When kids act entitled, they didn't invent it. They inherited it. They absorbed it at dinner tables, in car rides, in the way adults talk about other people. I said, "Sir, I want you to understand something. In my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground, and that's how it should be." I watched Mrs. Santos in the gallery sit up straighter when I said that, like she needed to hear it. The man on the phone went quiet for a second. Then he said, "Are you trying to teach me a lesson?" I said, "I'm trying to protect the public." He scoffed. He said, "Judge, my daughter has a future. Don't mess with her over a stupid ticket." I heard Ava whisper, "Tell him, Dad," like she was coaching him. I leaned forward and I said, "Sir, your daughter was driving at a speed that could kill someone. That's not stupid." I heard him say, "Nobody died, so stop pretending she's a criminal." I paused. I looked out at the room. I saw older people. I saw young people. I saw faces that had probably lost someone on a road. I felt the weight of that bench in my spine. I said, "Sir, you're on speaker in a public courtroom. I want you to choose your next words carefully." He said, "Fine. Here are my words. Drop it. Send me the bill." I watched Ava smile like she'd won again. And I'll be honest, I almost ended the call right there. I almost told him we were done. But something inside me said, "Keep going." I've learned to trust that voice. So I asked him, "Sir, what do you do for a living?" He chuckled and said, "I run companies. I create jobs. I don't have time for court games." I said, "What companies?" I heard a pause again, short but real. Then he said, "Does it matter?" I said, "It matters when you're trying to use power as a shield." He said, "Look, Judge, you don't want trouble. Let her go. I'll make a call." When he said that, I felt the room freeze. Even Ava's smile softened, just a little, like she knew that sounded bad. I said very quietly, "You'll make a call to who?" He snapped, "You know what I mean." That's when I noticed a man stand up in the gallery. I hadn't seen him earlier because he was sitting off to the side, dressed plain, quiet, watchful. I saw him now step into the aisle with a calm that didn't belong to an ordinary spectator. He held up a badge just enough for Christina and me to see. He said, "Your Honor, may I be heard?" I looked at Christina and I saw her face change. She reached under her desk and pulled out an envelope, sealed, with a federal stamp. My heart started to beat differently. I don't get rattled easily, but I knew in that instant something bigger had walked into my courtroom without making a sound. The man said, "I'm Assistant United States Attorney Daniel Reeves." The room murmured again, but this time the sound was fear, not gossip. I looked at Christina. She handed me the sealed envelope like it was hot. I took it, and I felt the paper edges press into my fingers. I could feel my pulse in my thumb. I opened it carefully. I unfolded the document inside. I started reading, and as I read, I felt my eyebrows lift, then my mouth go dry. In 40 years, I had never seen anything like this. I looked up at AUSA Reeves, and I said, "You want to explain this?" He nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor. We've been investigating Mr. Montgomery for months." I glanced at Ava. I watched her face still look confident, but I saw her blink faster now. I heard her whisper, "Dad," like she suddenly wanted comfort. I held the phone receiver closer and I said, "Sir, are you still there?" I heard him say, "Yeah, what is this?" For the first time, I heard real tension in his voice. I looked down again and I read the names, the charges, the details. I saw numbers that made my stomach drop. I saw words like wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction. I saw references to shell companies, fake invoices, stolen funds. AUSA Reeves said, "Your Honor, Miss Montgomery's traffic case brought her into a public setting. We have a sealed warrant related to her father's case. We also have reason to believe funds were used to purchase the vehicle in question." I felt a chill move through me because I realized how close I had come to treating this like a normal morning. I realized how quickly a person's attitude can hide a much darker truth. Before I tell you what those charges were, let me ask you this. Do you think wealth should protect someone from consequences? Should money put you above the law? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe everyone should be equal under the law like I do, hit that subscribe button. I looked at Ava and I said, "Miss Montgomery, your father is under federal investigation." I watched her face flicker, just a small crack in the wall. She tried to laugh, but it came out thin. She said, "That's not true." I looked at her and I said, "I'm holding the paperwork." I turned back to the phone and I said, "Sir, you heard the prosecutor." The man on the phone suddenly sounded different. His voice dropped. He said, "This is ridiculous. This is some kind of mistake." AUSA Reeves stepped closer and said, "Mr. Montgomery, you are currently on a recorded line in open court." When he said that, I heard silence on the other end, like someone had put their hand over the mouthpiece. I watched Ava's hands start to shake, the same hands that were so casual before, tapping the phone, waving off my warnings, suddenly looked like they didn't belong to her. I watched her grip the rail with both hands, like she was trying not to fall. I watched the color drain from her face. I've seen it before, but it's never exactly the same. It's the moment someone realizes the world they built in their head isn't real. It's the moment the truth kicks down the door. Ava looked at me with tears and said, "Your Honor, please." I felt something heavy in my chest because for the first time I saw genuine fear. Not the fake fear people put on to get sympathy. Real fear. I said to her, "Mrs. Montgomery," and then I caught myself. I said, "Miss Montgomery, 2 hours ago you were laughing." I saw her mouth open and close like she couldn't find words. She whispered, "I didn't know." I said, "You didn't know what?" She shook her head. She said, "I didn't know it was that bad." I looked at her and I said, "Here's what people don't see on TV. Every time you break a rule, you're practicing who you are." I watched her cry harder, and I felt the whole room leaning in, because even the people who came for their own cases could sense something big was happening. I turned to AUSA Reeves and I said, "What are you asking from my court today?" He said, "Your Honor, we're not here to litigate the federal case in your courtroom. We're here because we have information relevant to Miss Montgomery's vehicle and her father's use of intimidation." I looked down again at the documents. I read more. I saw allegations that Mr. Montgomery had threatened city employees. I saw that he had tried to interfere with public contracts. I saw the kind of arrogance that doesn't just insult a judge, it insults a whole community. I looked back at Ava and I said, "You told me to call your daddy." I paused. I let the words hang. I said, "Well, your daddy has answered, and now the truth is answering too." I heard her sob, and I didn't feel joy about it. I want you to understand that. I don't enjoy watching people fall apart. I've seen too many people fall apart in my courtroom. But I do believe consequences are sometimes the only language entitlement understands. I looked into the gallery again, and I saw Mrs. Santos watching with her hand over her mouth. I saw tears in her eyes too, but not the same kind. Hers were tears of shock and something like vindication. Not revenge, just the strange relief of seeing a powerful person finally face gravity. Ava said, "Can I call him back? Please." I said, "He's on the line." She looked at the phone like it was suddenly a snake. I lifted the receiver and I said, "Sir, your daughter is scared." I heard his voice come back, tight and angry. He said, "Give me my daughter, now." I said, "You don't give orders in my courtroom." He barked, "You think you're important because you have a robe?" I felt my spine stiffen, but I kept my voice calm. I said, "I'm important because the law is important." Then I said one of the lines I'll never forget saying. I looked straight ahead and I said, "Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy character, and it definitely can't buy your way above the law." The gallery was silent. Even Ava stopped crying for a moment, like the words hit her harder than she expected. AUSA Reeves said, "Your Honor, we also have a warrant for Mr. Montgomery's arrest based on probable cause for obstruction and additional charges." I looked at him and I said, "In my courtroom?" He said, "Federal agents are outside." Everything happened so fast after that, but time also seemed to slow. I watched Ava sway slightly, like she might faint. I saw Christina step forward quietly, ready to help if she fell. I said to Ava, "Sit down." She didn't sit at first. She just stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Then she sank into the chair beside counsel table, and I heard her breathing turn ragged. I said to her, "Miss Montgomery, I'm going to deal with your traffic charges now." She looked up at me with watery eyes. She said, "Please, please don't. I can't. My life." I had to pause. I had to remind myself she was 17. I had to remind myself that kids sometimes act like monsters because they've been taught to. I had to remind myself that this was still a human being in pain, even if she had caused pain. I said, "Your life isn't over because you have to face consequences. Your life gets worse when you refuse to learn." I watched her wipe her face with the back of her hand like she didn't have a napkin. The tough girl mask was gone. I addressed the speeding first. I told her the facts. I told her the danger. I said, "You were driving like nobody else mattered." She whispered, "I know." I said, "Do you?" She nodded, and I believed her for the first time. I said, "I'm suspending your license for a period set by law." She sobbed again and said, "How will I get to school?" I said, "The same way Mrs. Santos gets to work when her car breaks. You'll figure it out." I said, "I'm also imposing a fine." She flinched like the word fine suddenly meant something now. I said, and you're going to complete a driving safety course. She nodded quickly, like she'd agree to anything. I leaned forward and I said, "This isn't about punishing you because I don't like you. This is about keeping innocent people alive." I watched her lower her head, and I saw shame finally take a seat beside her. Then I heard movement near the doors. I watched as 2 federal agents approached. They didn't rush. They didn't grandstand. They moved with that quiet certainty that tells you they already know how the story ends. They stepped toward the aisle, and I saw one of them nod to AUSA Reeves. Reeves turned slightly, and he said, "Your Honor, if I may, we have Mr. Montgomery in custody outside. We need to enter briefly to confirm certain statements made on the recorded call." I felt the courtroom tense like a held breath. I looked down at the phone. I realized the father was still on the line. He was still listening. He had heard everything. I picked up the receiver and I said, "Sir, are you hearing me?" I heard him say, "What are you doing? You can't do this." His voice had lost all that swagger. It sounded like a man standing on ice that's cracking. I said, "Sir, I'm not doing this. Your choices did this." I heard him breathing hard. I heard him say, "Put my lawyer on." I said, "You should have called your lawyer before you tried to bully a courtroom." Ava looked up at me and whispered, "Is he coming in here?" I didn't answer right away because I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But I also didn't want to lie. I said, "I don't control what the federal government does." I watched her eyes widen. I watched her swallow. I watched her realize her father wasn't a shield anymore. He was a storm. I said, "Miss Montgomery, I want you to listen to me." She looked at me like a child now, not a queen, a child. I said, "You need to understand what happened today. You walked in thinking you could order the world around. You walked in thinking you could laugh at people like Mrs. Santos. But the law has a way of pulling masks off." I looked out at the gallery and I said, "I want everyone here to hear something." I paused. I said, "The law isn't perfect, but it's supposed to be fair. And fairness means nobody gets to buy their way out of accountability." I watched the federal agents step closer to the front, and I heard the sound of their shoes, firm and steady. It sounded like punctuation at the end of a long lie. I watched Ava's designer bag slide off her shoulder and land on the floor with a soft thud. Nobody picked it up. That moment stuck with me because it felt like a symbol. All that status, all that showing off, and now it was just an object on the ground. I thought about Mrs. Santos, the nurse Ava had laughed at. I thought about how Mrs. Santos probably has to budget every week to make gas last. I thought about how she still showed up with dignity. I thought about how dignity doesn't cost $1. I watched as the agent spoke quietly with AUSA Reeves. I heard Reeves say, "We're going to enter Mr. Montgomery for identification on the call log." I looked at Christina, and she looked back at me, eyes wide but steady. Christina has a spine of steel. I nodded once. Then I saw him. I watched a man in an expensive suit step into my courtroom, hands cuffed in front. I saw his face tight with rage, but I also saw fear behind it. I saw his eyes scan the room like he wanted to find someone to blame. I heard the sound of the handcuffs when he moved. I'll never forget that sound. Metal doesn't care who you are. Metal doesn't care about donations or cars or shoes. Ava gasped like the air got stolen from her lungs. She whispered, "Daddy," and it didn't sound like arrogance anymore. It sounded like grief. Mr. Montgomery looked at her, and his face shifted for a second, like he wanted to protect her. Then the mask came back. He looked at me and said, "This is a circus." I leaned forward so he could see how serious I was. I said, "No, sir, this is accountability." I paused. I said, "And you tried to turn my courtroom into a phone call favor." He sneered. He said, "You'll regret this." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I said, "I don't regret telling the truth." The agents guided him back out as Reeves spoke with him. I watched Ava collapse into quiet sobs, her shoulders shaking like a small animal in the rain. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these, seeing that the law really does apply to everyone equally. If this story is restoring your faith in justice, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to see it. After the agents left, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. I could feel the weight of it. I could see people looking at each other like they were thinking, "Did that really happen?" I've had days in court that felt like paperwork. That day felt like thunder. I looked at Ava and I said, "Miss Montgomery, I want you to hear me again." She lifted her head. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in thin, dark lines. She didn't look glamorous anymore. She looked like a kid who didn't know what to do. I said, "You are responsible for your own choices." She nodded weakly. I said, "And your father is responsible for his." She whispered, "He didn't tell me." I said, "Maybe he didn't, but he did teach you something, whether he meant to or not." She looked at me with confusion. I said, "He taught you that power means you don't have to respect people." I paused. I said, "And that lesson almost got someone killed on the road." She started crying again, but softer now, like the fight had drained out of her. I said, "I'm not going to pretend this is easy." I said, "But you're going to have to grow up fast." I ordered her license suspension according to the rules, and I set the safety course. I gave her a payment plan because she was still a minor, and I wasn't going to pretend she had a bank account. I said, "You're going to feel this." I said, "And you should." I watched her nod like she finally understood that consequences aren't personal attacks, they're boundaries. Later that afternoon, the U.S. Attorney came to my chambers. I sat behind my desk with my tie loosened, and I could still hear that laugh from the morning in my mind, like an echo that wouldn't leave. The U.S. Attorney explained the full investigation. I learned that Mr. Montgomery had been running a contracting scheme using shell companies, moving money through fake invoices, and threatening people who asked questions. I heard details that made my stomach churn, because the money wasn't just numbers, it was public money. It was money meant for roads, schools, services. The numbers were staggering, millions of dollars. I sat there thinking about how I almost just gave his daughter a fine and sent her on her way. I thought about how close the law came to missing the bigger truth. I said to the U.S. Attorney, "How long have you been building this?" He said, "Long enough to know he thinks he's untouchable." I nodded slowly, because I'd met that kind of person on my bench before. Different names, same soul. That night I went home, and my wife looked at me like she always does. She said, "Tough day?" I sat at the table, and I didn't even reach for food at first. I said, "I watched a kid learn in 1 hour what most people learn over years." My wife said, "Did it break your heart?" I said, "It did." I said, "But it also reminded me why this job matters." 2 months later, I received a letter from Ava from detention because the federal case had dragged her family into a different world, and she had been placed under supervision due to related issues that came out after her father's arrest. I almost didn't open it. I'm not proud to say it, but I hesitated. I see a lot of tears in court. Some are real, some are tools. I didn't know which kind hers would be on paper, but something made me open it. Maybe it was my father's voice in my head. Maybe it was the memory of her face when the handcuffs clicked on her father. Maybe it was the simple truth that she was still young. She wrote, and I'm reading this directly, that she hated me that morning. She wrote that she thought I was just another person she could push around. She wrote that she didn't even notice Mrs. Santos until she saw Mrs. Santos crying after court because she was overwhelmed by her own life and also overwhelmed by what she had witnessed. Ava wrote that she had never seen her father scared before. She wrote that she realized her whole world was built on fear and money and pretending. She wrote that when I said money can't buy character, it made her feel exposed. She wrote, "I didn't even know I was empty until you said that." I sat there with the letter in my hand, and I felt something in my chest loosen, like a knot giving way. I'm not naive. I don't think one letter fixes a person, but I do believe moments can start change. It made me think about my father's words again. It made me think about how he taught me respect by showing it, even when he had nothing. It made me think about how kids learn what they live. 3 days after the arrest, Mrs. Santos came to see me. She didn't come into the courtroom. She came to my chamber's doorway after her shift, still wearing that same badge. She stood there like she wasn't sure she belonged in that hallway. I stood up from my chair because I wanted her to know she mattered. I said, "Mrs. Santos, come in." She stepped forward and she held her hands together like she was praying. She thanked me for dismissing her case, but she also thanked me for something else. She said, "Your Honor, when you said a nurse and a millionaire stand on the same ground, I felt like you were talking to me." Her voice broke, and I felt tears come to my eyes when she said that. She said, "My daughter wants to be the first in our family to go to college." I nodded and I said, "That's a beautiful goal." She said, "I've been scared she won't have a chance." I said, "She has a chance." A year later, I heard that recovered money from the federal case, once it moved through the system, helped fund programs to repair parts of the community that had been neglected. I'm careful with claims like that because government budgets are complicated, but I was told a portion went toward scholarships tied to community restoration efforts. And guess who received the first scholarship? Mrs. Santos's daughter. When I heard that, I sat back in my chair and I just stared at the wall for a minute. I felt that strange, quiet gratitude that comes when you see a circle close. I thought about Ava, about how entitlement almost crushed her humanity. I thought about Mrs. Santos, about how dignity held her up when life tried to push her down. I think about that day often. What it taught me still sits with me like a stone in my pocket. It reminds me that arrogance is loud but fragile. It reminds me that respect is quiet but strong. My father came to this country with nothing. He taught me that your name matters more than your wallet. He taught me that you don't step on people just because you can. He taught me that the way you treat a stranger tells the truth about you. After 40 years, I still believe the law is the great equalizer. It's not perfect. People make mistakes. Systems fail sometimes. But the idea of equality under the law is sacred to me. Money can't buy integrity. It can't buy respect. It can't buy your way out of the mirror when you finally have to look at yourself. I told myself that morning, before I knew any of it, that I wanted to do some good. I didn't know the good would come through a storm. I didn't know it would come through a teen saying, "Call my daddy," like the world was her personal service desk. But I learned again that day that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a simple sentence spoken calmly. Sometimes it's a phone call put on speaker. Sometimes it's the sound of handcuffs that remind everyone in the room that we all live under the same rules. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her, or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Judge Anthony Caruso. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law. Every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.